Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Very happy that you could join us live at Programmers Week 2021. This is the last day of what has been a week full of tech talks, inspiring keynotes, and amazing guests. I am Julian Hostiuk, Delivery Director at Cognizant Softvision, Romania. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our next special guest. Steve Westgarth is the Head of Engineering at Boots UK, one of our top strategic partners in Europe. He is, first of all, a passionate software developer, just like you, with an extensive experience designing and implementing transformative agile delivery organization. He is a strong advocate for the belief that organizations need to always embrace change for the better with regards to ways of working of their internal teams and improving the lives of their customers through software. Interestingly enough, Steve will talk to us today about morality in a digital world that is always under pressure to deliver faster and better. This will be a very captivating keynote, so stay tuned and please type in your questions throughout the session in the chat module, and we will address them at the end. Steve, very interested to listen to the tale you have prepared for us and maybe hear more about that Kaizen philosophy as well. Why not? Over to you.
Thanks very much. And hello, everyone. First of all, a huge thank you to Cognizant for organising Programmers Week and for inviting me to speak at the event. My name is Steve Westgarth. I'm the Head of Engineering at Boots UK, and my pronouns are he, him, and his, and it's great to be talking to you all today. Let's just share the presentation and we'll jump straight in. So before we begin today, what I would like you all to do is to just think of the name of a famous scientist or inventor. Literally the first name that pops into your head. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everyone got one? So I wonder how many of you on the call are thinking of this man, Albert Einstein. And of course, Albert is a very worthy choice, but I wonder if that was a deliberate choice. Did you deliberately think of a man? Maybe you couldn't think of a woman. Maybe somebody didn't spring to mind. But there were lots of choices. I mean, literally hundreds of choices. You've got people like Katherine Johnson, Marie Curie, hundreds of women who've made amazing scientific contributions. But I would be prepared to bet that the majority of people on the call today probably thought of a man, and I would say the large majority of you probably thought of Albert Einstein. So that is an example of an unintended consequence. Maybe it's an example of how society has conditioned us because of Albert's great achievements. But there are many scientific discoveries that have been made by literally hundreds of thousands of people. Today, I want to explore with you unintended consequences and whether or not some consequences should or could be avoided. And I want to relate that back to our work in the digital world and how we as software developers are responsible for unintended consequences literally every day. So let's start by exploring what we mean by unintended consequences. So I was looking for a definition. I was looking around and kind of seeing, well, who's spoken about this before? And I came across this guy, Rob Norton. So Rob is the former economics editor of Fortune magazine, and he is quoted as saying that the actions of people, and especially governments, always have effects that are unanticipated or unintended. And I guess that's probably as good a definition as any. It's something which happens that you didn't intend to happen. And of course, we see this in everyday life. Probably the most recent example, speaking as to somebody who is in the UK in recent times, is Brexit. So back in 2016, we had a huge Brexit referendum, and the UK population decided to vote to leave Europe. Now, it doesn't matter in the UK whether you voted to leave or to remain. I don't think anybody would have anticipated the monumental impact that vote would have, and what led to 3, 4, 5 years of internal wrangling in the UK as to what leaving Europe would actually look like. In January this year, Bloomberg Economics published research that Brexit will have cost the UK economy somewhere in the region of $200 billion. That's more money than was paid into the European Union over the full 47 years of membership. Now, we can argue the accuracy of the research, and we can say, well, maybe it's not $200 million. But I think we'd all agree that the cost is significantly higher than anybody ever realized it would be. That's yet another example of an unintended consequence. And of course, not all unintended consequences are quite so significant. And to illustrate that, I want to go back to something which is common in every household. Let's talk about a sink. So everyone has a sink in their house, in their kitchen, in their bathroom, and we're probably quite familiar with how the taps work. So just to illustrate that, you would typically have a hot tap and a cold tap, and there's probably some sort of water fountain. And when you turn the hot tap up, the water comes out. And when you turn the cold tap up, then the cold water comes out. And when you reset the taps to the center, the water stops flowing. And you can usually achieve the rate of flow by turning the tap more or less. So back in the 1970s, there was a guy called Mortimer, and he looked at this mental model, and he said that he didn't think it made sense. So Mortimer went about starting to create a new way that he thought a sink should work. So he looked at the problem, and he said, well, we've got two taps. We've got a water fountain in the middle, but I think it would make much more sense if the tap on the left, when you turn that, if that switched the hot water on by turning the tap to the top and the cold water on by switching the tap to the bottom, and we would adjust the flow by using the tap on the right. By turning the tap up to the top, it would go slower, and by pulling the tap to the bottom, it would go faster. Now, that to him made a lot of sense. And he was saying that, in his way of experience and what he was thinking about the way a sink should work, that will be much more intuitive for people to use. That effectively required people to create a new mental model, a new way of thinking about how a sink would work. And he very quickly got some really interesting feedback after he brought this to market. People said it was unintuitive, there was poor design, it wasn't easy to use. And that really blew his mind, because he was thinking, surely this makes more sense. It makes more sense to me, therefore everybody should understand that this is a better way to have a sink within your house. Ultimately, it didn't take off, and everybody stayed with the traditional sink model that we're all used to today. We see other examples of this in society. So think about in your car. So when Henry Ford first produced his car, there was a lot of talk around, well, how should the pedals work? In fact, there was even talk about, should there be pedals? And we kind of standardized on having the accelerator on the right-hand side, the brake in the middle, and the clutch on the left. Imagine the consequences if we swapped the positioning of those pedals today. Imagine what would happen if the accelerator was in the position of the clutch, or maybe the accelerator was in the position of the brake. Imagine the unintended consequences a decision like that could drive. We obviously aren't going to change that. It's very unlikely that people will propose to create a new mental model in that way. But I think it's probably an illustration that asking people to change their mental model is risky. This is what people expect to happen when they're using a system or when they're interacting with a particular interface or program. So changing people's mental models, very dangerous, very risky, and something that we should do with caution. And this next story illustrates some of that. So in my job, I have the very great privilege of going to a whole range of conferences. And a few years ago, I went to a design conference, and this gentleman on the screen, Joe Leach, gave a fantastic presentation. Now, Joe, he is the author of a book called Psychology for Designers. It's well worth a read if you haven't had a read. And in the book, Joe describes something that happened way back in 2002. So in 2002, Joe visited Argentina. He went on a trip, and it was a bit of a holiday. He took some family away with him to see what Argentina had to offer. Now, lots of things happened in 2002. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars Episode 2, and Spider-Man 3, they were the three biggest films. Halle Berry was the first Black woman to win an Academy Award for Best Actress. Ben Affleck was voted People magazine's sexiest man alive. Michael Jackson caused international sensation by dangling Prince Michael II off a balcony in his hotel room. But this was Joe's first visit to Argentina. And it being his first visit is a very important part of this story. Now, We've all been there. It's not necessarily a great experience. You're in a foreign country and you need to withdraw some money. So you go to a cash point, you put your card in, and you hope the card's going to give you some cash. So this machine did give Joe some cash, but it didn't return his card. His card was swallowed by the machine. Now, when you're abroad, that's clearly a huge inconvenience. But Joe went and found a bank, he cancelled his cards, he got someone back home to wire him some money. It took a bit of time, but life moved on. It really wasn't the end of the world. And you could even say that he forgot about the incident. So let's fast forward to 2012. So 2012, Joe took a second trip to Argentina. And when he went to Argentina a second time, he also needed to withdraw some cash. So he went back to a cash point, put his cash card in, went through the same process, and for a second time, the machine swallowed his card. Now, you could just put this down to coincidence, and you could say, well, maybe it was just bad luck that had happened. But in the intervening 10 years, Joe's card hadn't been swallowed by any other machine anywhere that he'd been in the world. But in Argentina, it had been swallowed twice, both occasions when he'd used an Argentinian. So Joe started to think, what was going on? What was happening in this process? Because surely it was too much of a coincidence that his card had been swallowed twice. So Joe walked through the process. And a typical process, when you go to a cash point, you put in your card, you enter your PIN number, you then select withdraw cash, you then select the amount, the card then gets returned, and in the final step, the cash is dispensed. And when Joe analysed this process, he went through, so I put in my card, I entered my PIN number, withdrew cash, select amount, but then the card was returned after the cash was dispensed. So these last two steps in the process, they'd been switched around. And actually what Joe realised was his card hadn't actually been swallowed. He'd simply walked away from the cash point once the cash had been dispensed, thinking the transaction was over. He assumed his mental model told him that his journey was complete. He'd received that golden moment, that moment of euphoria when you think that that action has been completed. And he walked away. Now, that reinforces that asking people to change their mental model is risky, because when you do that, it means that something's going to be different, something's going to be unexpected in that experience. And I think this video that I found online of one of my favourite shows exemplifies that more than anything. And that is, of course, Dawn French in the Vicar of Dibley, jumping in puddles and realising that when the puddle is much deeper than she expected, she doesn't expect to be neck deep in the water. Now, if we compare this to software development, at Boots, we are really fortunate because all of our design work goes through rounds of usability testing. What's really interesting is that we tend to do that at the design stage, and we don't usually return to it after the system has gone live, unless somebody identifies that something isn't working as expected. So we therefore assume that what's been designed is therefore what we put into the wild, and that's what happened when the software is released. It's working as we expected. Now, in the example of Joe, we think about what happened when the machine swapped those steps of the process, and you would say, well, was that a deliberate act of sabotage? Did an engineer think, you know what, I'm really going to mess with people's minds. I'm going to swap that process around so that it really confuses people. I don't believe that for a second. I think that at best it was maybe a mistake. Maybe somebody just got the process wrong. Maybe they just put those steps in the wrong order. Worst, maybe a product owner somewhere had not understood how cash points elsewhere in the world work. Maybe there wasn't time to go and look at how other cash points in other countries work. So I would definitely bet on it being an innocent mistake. No one had the forethought to check the system worked the same as all of the other cash points. But that does introduce an interesting concept. That means that we as software developers, we are literally the last line of defense. Because if we get it wrong and somebody doesn't notice the mistake, if test doesn't pick it up, maybe it's a really subtle mistake, we could actually affect people's lives. And I mean, that might have made hundreds, thousands of people lose cards as a result of going to Argentina and using those cash points. So whose responsibility is that? Whose responsibility is the inconvenience that we've caused to those users? Does the company who built the software even know that it's a problem? And if they did, would there be any budget to fix it? So this isn't an isolated example. We've all heard of the war between Apple and Android. Now, me personally, I love iOS. I've been an Apple fanboy for many years. I got an iPhone when they first came out back in 2007. In fact, I remember watching the Steve Jobs keynote and thinking this is going to revolutionize my life, and it did. One of my best friends, Jez, he loves Android. And we have this constant battle where we talk about which is better, iOS or Android. So a few years ago, I thought, you know what? I know I like Apple. You know, I know I've loved the operating system. I know they've done a great job, but I need to try Android in order to disprove Jez. I need to tell him why Apple is better than Android. And the only way I can do that is to walk a mile in that man's shoes. So I did. I tried Android for 1 week. I set myself a challenge and I managed to last 1 day. So why did I last a day? Well, the answer is I found it really unintuitive. I found it a really difficult phone to use. So when I was thinking about this talk and the unintended consequences that software can have, I thought, well, what is it? What is it about Android that I don't like? Because thousands of other people do. So there must be a reason. There must be something that I can hang my hat on that says, this is what I don't like about Android. So I started looking at the user interface, and there's some examples here going back several years, several different versions of iOS. And there's a fundamental concept that when you swipe to the left, you get some options. So traditionally, you would see the delete option. If you're on a table view, swipe to the left, you would see delete. And that's something which has been a feature of every version of iOS since the very early days. Since iOS 1, you've been able to swipe to the left in order to delete from a table view. So then I compared that to what happens on Android. And on Android, you swipe to the right. So to get that delete option, you literally do the opposite thing. So think about it. I've been using iOS for years, since 2007. Every day, I've been constantly swiping to the left to delete. I get a new device, I get an Android device, and my mental model has to change. I'm expected to do something different that I'm not used to. And that feels weird. But if you put the boot on the other foot, you can also see that an Android user would think exactly the same of an Apple product. So, Android, swipe right, Apple, swipe left, and if you look through the interfaces, there are hundreds of differences that are just like that. Now, I wonder, when Android was first being developed at Google, whether they thought, hey, you know what? This is going to be more intuitive. Maybe they went out and did a body of user research to work out how somebody wanted to swipe. At the time, people were talking about how revolutionary it was that you could swipe to delete. I wonder if the decision to swipe to the right rather than swipe to the left was made purely by a developer who was implementing a feature. And I guess we'll never know. But those fundamental subtle differences are changing people's mental models and making the other operating system a difficult choice, something which people don't necessarily want to switch to. And that's something that we as engineers, in the software that we write, we have control of that. We can start to think about, what will our users expect? When a user uses our product, what would they want to see? Humans are fundamentally creatures of habit. We build habits every day, and we look at everything from maybe we go exercising in the morning, maybe we get up at a certain time, we go to bed at a certain time. On average, it takes 26 days for a human to form a habit. And after that habit has been created, it's very difficult to change it. I stand here as a gay man. I probably don't meet the stereotype of what people would typically think of as someone who's gay, but nonetheless, I certainly don't hide my sexuality. I've totally lost count of the number of times I've heard as part of everyday life, people refer to something as gay. And it's usually part of something negative. The car won't start. Well, that's gay. You're not coming out tonight. Well, that's gay. Now, it's fair to say when I hear people describing this, generally, they don't mean any harm. It's simply something which they've habitualized, that's part of their everyday life. But for many years, whenever I heard such comments, I didn't say anything about it, but it hurt a little bit inside. The unintended consequence of my lack of action is that the offender was blissfully unaware that their actions had resulted in any form of negative consequence. So negative consequences that aren't seen are surely more damaging than consequences that are. Now, you might think that that's an isolated example, but there are many others. When was the last time you walked into a room and heard someone in the office greet you with a "Morning, guys"? Apart from the obvious fact that half of your workforce is likely to be female, even if you were in a room full of guys, spare a thought for the guy in the room who is questioning their gender identity. The guy who desperately wants to be a girl, or maybe even the guy who hasn't yet defined what they are. These are damaging unintended consequences. They really need the person to think about what the effect of those consequences is going to be and think about how they might be able to avoid it. And that requires you to think about the person who is going to be on the receiving end of those consequences. Let's talk about cake, another favorite topic of mine. So if we think about this cake, who's the customer? So there are several answers. You might say that the chef who bakes the cake, well, he's probably going to sample the cake. He's going to have a little taste as he bakes it. Maybe he is the client. Maybe we're making the cake for him. That's paying his wages, so maybe that's important too. You could argue that Tesco, the store that's going to sell the cake, maybe that's the customer. You could argue that the person who buys it, well, they might be the cake. Or maybe you could argue that Millie, the person who eats the cake, she's the client, she's the real person who we're baking the cake for. So I think we would probably all agree that we're baking the cake for Millie. So as software engineers, how often do you ask yourself when you're building a piece of software, who are you building this software for? Who is ultimately going to use it? Who is going to be on the receiving end of whatever you put into code? And I think we would all agree we need to connect Millie to the chef, because by connecting Millie to the chef, we can make sure that Millie's thoughts, dreams, and ambitions are taken into account as part of the work that she's doing. We want to make sure that ultimately Millie gets what she wants when she eats that cake, and she doesn't get a negative experience as a result. So before you think about what you're going to write, how you're going to translate a user story, how you're going to bring something to life, you need to think about walking a mile in their shoes. As Jack Andy says, at the very worst, you're going to be a mile away from them and you'll have their shoes. But at best, you can actually impact and make sure they have an absolutely amazing experience. So, working in delivery at a large corporate, I can very easily believe that a lot of our systems, not they always are, they're usually built with a date in mind. We've got to get something out of the door. That's the date that we've attached a business case to. That's when we've told somebody that they're going to receive a product. But even though you feel that pressure, creating great software is your responsibility, because your software can damage people's lives. And this next video I'm going to show you, I think, exemplifies that moral story in a really great way. And I'm a great advocate. If somebody says something better than you can say it yourself, then let them say it. So I found this video on YouTube and I want to share it with you today. I think this epitomizes what we as software developers do and why it's really important that we take our job seriously.
A few years ago, I got a message from an ex, and it said, "Roses are red, violets are blue. I've got chlamydia and you might have too." Which, first of all, is genius, but it meant I was taking a trip down to the clinic the next morning to get tested. I have a point to this story, and I swear it's about computers. If you ever want to see a complete cross-section of London life, do join the queue for the STI testing clinic first thing in the morning. Actually, get yourself tested anyway, it's the right thing to do. Anyway, I go to the clinic, I pee in a sample tube, I seal it up, I hand it over, and they give me a little business card with a phone number and a passcode on it. And I can call that number the next day, and if my tests are all clear, then the system will tell me. And if they're not, it will pass me over to someone at the clinic, because you do not deliver bad news with an automated system. So the next day, I call the number, type in the code, and the system says, "Thanks, here are your test results." And then there is a pause, a proper 10-second long pause, and as I stood there on my mobile in the middle of the street, it felt a little bit like that artificial pause they had in reality shows before they announced the winner. It felt like there was a spotlight on me, there was all dramatic tension music playing in the background, and then it says, "We're putting you through to one of our team. Please stand by." That's bad news, right? Bad news comes from a human. Why are they passing me through? Someone picks up. I give them a passcode again, and they say, "No, it's all clear. You don't need to worry. Everything's negative. You're fine." And I ask why the system put me through, and they say, "Oh, no idea. It just does that sometimes." It just does that sometimes. Did the database lookup fail in the background, and it dealt with a timeout by just passing me to a human? Was there a small note on my file somewhere that confused it? I've no idea. They had no idea, because whoever wrote that code, whoever designed that system, the moment there was any error, they just told it to go to, "We're putting you through," without explaining why and without thinking what that might cause. That phone system is used by people asking about things way more serious than chlamydia, the sort of things that you can't cure with a course of antibiotics. And sure, on the scale of complaints, it is minor, but mistakes like that are a symptom of something much bigger. I've talked about bodging things in the past. I encourage it for hobby projects. Just slapping something together as a proof of concept, just so it works for you, is a great principle when you are making a thing for yourself. But if you're making something for the public, for mass consumption particularly, something that is going to be used by people in very vulnerable moments, then you've got to take a lot more care. Every time we build something for the public, we have to start making a trade-off. How much time and money is it worth to deal with every edge case? Maybe the designer thought that lookups would only fail 1 in a million times, and if that's the case, then yeah, it's probably not reasonable to bother recording a whole extra message and programming in a whole extra edge case. But if the lookup fails often enough that the clinic receptionist just dismisses it as normal, well, by that point it's too late to make the change, isn't it? The system's in place, it'd be far too expensive to fix it now. It'll do. The trouble is that we're often dealing with unknown harms and unintended consequences. Far too often, a bodged-together system that was just meant to be a test gets rolled out into production, and everyone just has to deal with the bugs because that's all anyone can afford to do. I will always bet on incompetence rather than malice. I will always bet on someone just not thinking about consequences rather than thinking of them and going, who cares? We see this with big tech companies. Facebook allows the world to communicate in unprecedented ways. It does huge amounts of emotional labour for us. It allows people to keep in touch with old friends that they would just fall away from otherwise. But it's also enabled stalkers and abusers to reach people that they shouldn't. It's allowed a huge amount of private data to be misused without real consent, and it's arguably helped cause terrifying election meddling. Now, I don't believe anyone in Facebook's management was rubbing their hands in delight at the chaos it was causing. It's just a series of seemingly reasonable decisions that added up to huge consequences. And then there's YouTube. It allows anyone to publish their experiences to the world. It provides income for creative people that bypasses traditional media, and it's helped people connect with other people's lives. It's also helped radicalise folks to promote conspiracy theories and to traumatise children. Are those trade-offs worth it? Depends on your moral framework, and it depends, let's be honest, on how it's affected you personally. It's not like there's a crystal ball that'll tell you, yes, your brand new dating app you're developing, that will cause 1,000 couples to marry and live happily ever after. but it will also get 3 people murdered. The real world is not a trolley problem. The STI result system that I called presumably reduced the workload on staff, and it allowed people to check the results out of hours when it was convenient and discreet for them. You would hope that something like that wouldn't have a downside, but then the designers screwed it up because they thought it was good enough, and it wasn't. One extra check, one extra voice message that said, "Sorry, I can't find your result, just a moment," would have solved that. Every time that we design a system, we have to minimize the potential of harm. Look at the code you write. Look at the systems you design and think, how could this be abused? How could this fall apart? What are the failure states here? If you were a bad actor, if you wanted to use this maliciously, how would you go about it? Think about how you'd attack your own systems, explore those failure states, deliberately screw things up, and see how your code copes, because if you don't, someone else will. Thank you very much to the Centre for Computing History at Cambridge, who've let me film with all their old equipment, and to all my proofreading team who checked through my script.
So, the software that we create is our collective professional responsibility. Now, you might argue that very few systems would have such a radical impact as the one that we've just seen. But think about the software that you're writing every day. That missing alt tag that you forgot to put in. The consequences that would have to a user who was using a screen reader to access your system. Therefore, that alt tag's really important. That has an unintended consequence. You didn't intend that user not to be able to access that system. What about NPM packages? Maybe you haven't checked the provenance of who has created that NPM package and who is maintaining it. And in a year's time, there's security vulnerabilities that aren't patched. And as a result, that means that a bad actor is able to inject malicious code into your website. Maybe that inline style that you put into your system because that's convenient to you because it was easy to do. And the unintended consequence that has on another engineer who comes along in 6 months' time, and it takes them a little bit of extra time to work out what you've done. You have the power to have a really positive influence on people's lives. You just need to think about what the consequences of your code is going to be. Who is going to use it? Who is going to see it? Who is your customer? So next time you have a delivery pressure and you're battling to get something out of the door, if it comes to like that a database lookup fails intermittently, or if there isn't time to test all of the edge cases, I really hope that as a result of this talk, you might just step back and consider what that could mean to someone else. I genuinely believe that within our business, there is no higher purpose than finding ways to surprise and delight our users. Yes, absolutely, sometimes compromises are needed. And yes, sometimes the systems that we build need to go out into the wild in a less than perfect state. But as a community and as an industry, we need to make sure that the software we put into the wild doesn't adversely affect the lives of others. Our reputations are on the line here. A bad experience there, a poor experience there, will lead customers to talk about those experiences that will lead to negative press. You never know, someone might just pop at a conference and talk about how bad a system was or how it would negatively impact one of the users that they were dealing with. Or maybe that unintended consequence will sail under the radar, completely silent and unnoticed. Every day, we find ourselves morally challenged. There's a climate emergency. Parts of the world are starving. It's still illegal in more than 70 countries to be gay. These are big problems, and we must do everything we can to help and protect our planet. And yet, here we sit as technology professionals. We find ourselves in a unique position where we are able to directly affect and change the lives of thousands, and in some cases, millions of people. Think about Boots during the pandemic. We were classified an essential retailer. We weren't a retailer who was, a standard retailer on the street that actually, what if they weren't essential, it wouldn't matter? No, we were providing healthcare services, literally on the front line, helping our nation to get through COVID-19. The software that we wrote in Boots directly supported and helped the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are so many other examples of people that in our organization we help. Literally hundreds of millions of users that use our systems worldwide through WBA every day. So, in the grand scheme of things, Joe losing his debit card on holiday, someone having to wait a few extra minutes to get their STI test result, maybe that developer who needs to go and search for that inline style, the user who can't access the image that you didn't put the alt tag on, or the security issues that were caused by the NPM package. Maybe they aren't the biggest deal in the world. But as software developers, as engineers, as industry professionals, affecting those things are in our direct control. We have the power to make people's lives just that little bit better. So I'm going to leave you today with this thought. Is it morally acceptable to not consider the negative impact or the unintended consequences our work can have on people's lives? Is that acceptable? And is that something you're willing to do? Thanks very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. If there are any questions, I'm really happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Indeed, very interesting and inspiring examples about products, about technology, about life, actually, realities and consequences of our decisions and actions, even the small ones, right, that maybe we don't pay too much attention to. Well,
I think it's right. I think it's something which is very true. And I talk to a lot of engineers every day. And, sometimes it is the little things that you can do. It's almost death by a thousand cuts. If everybody made a decision that they were going to make sure that one thing tomorrow didn't have an unexpected consequence, we have, even just within Boots, maybe 200, 250 engineers working. Imagine the difference that can have to people's lives.
Indeed. I have one question here from the audience. What kind of discovery does your team do? Do you always start with some kind of design thinking exercises, or how do you get to build that product that really changes people's lives and we don't end up doing those mistakes that you have talked to us about?
Yeah, definitely. So I think design thinking is with our organization is something which is quite new. It's something which our product organization, our product managers are getting to grips with, and our engineers are kind of understanding what it really means. It's definitely our direction of travel to be a design-led organization. You're really introducing that design thinking into our process. I think that what our organization is becoming much more aware of is where the customer sits, and that actually we are building something for the Boots customer. So when you come to the Boots website, you might be looking to access a pharmacy service, or you might be looking to access an optician service, or maybe online retail, but you're just a Boots customer, and every customer needs to be able to access all parts of our estate in that really coherent way. So I think people are really connecting the dots and working out what that means to our organization and how we can have a more positive effect on our customers. We do quite a lot of things where we'll go out and we'll A/B test with customers, and we'll kind of look at, well, would they prefer this or would they prefer that? We also want to look at something called guerrilla usability testing, which I think is something which is really key. And this is about going out, maybe into your local coffee shop, or onto the street and saying, here's my system, and just grab a real world user and get them to use it and observe kind of their actions. Because I think sometimes as engineers, and as product, within product organizations, people can kind of get really engrossed in a system and understanding kind of how the system works, or what we expect from the system. But if you're too embedded within that, then you actually miss the real world element of it. And people will come along. I've seen it myself when you've done that. You'll see people using your system in a way you didn't expect, and you're like, "Oh, you did that? I didn't expect you to do that. That wasn't what I expected. I expected that." And suddenly that opens up new ideas and new possibilities that you can then start to rectify in your software. So I think it's really important for all organizations to embrace it. I'm not going to try and claim that the Boots is a great example by any means. I think Boots, like a lot of organizations, is learning how to do that, and we're committed to getting better. And I think you'll start to see that over the next few years, as we behave more like a software company should, because at the end of the day we are a provider of digital systems, as I said, for millions of customers.
Yeah, somebody has been saying recently, that every company is a software company or will become a software company, no matter the industry or no matter where they are in the business. Everybody is doing or using software one way or another, right? That's the reality.
It's really interesting. I mean, if you think about Boots, Boots traditionally has been a retailer, on our high street. You've only got to look at the effect over the COVID-19 pandemic at the rate with which digitization in our company has accelerated, and the increase in volume of orders on Boots.com. Now, that's not saying that the high street doesn't have a future. Absolutely, retail has a future on the high street. But I think customers very much are expecting a much more omni-channel proposition, where they're expecting to kind of be able to move seamlessly between what's on mobile, what's on web, what's in person, what their experience is throughout all of those transition states. And I think you'll start to see, and in fact, you already do with some. You've only got to look at Apple, for example. Probably my best example of this, where I can order something on my mobile phone. As I'm approaching the Apple store, your location service will detect that and will alert the store ahead of time that I may be going in to collect from store the item that I purchased. When I'm in store, maybe I then scan a product off the shelf, pay for it on my phone, and then walk out of the store. I've transitioned between a digital experience and an offline experience or an in-person experience totally seamlessly. And I think you can definitely see the high street developing more and more experiences like that, in order to be more convenient to the user and to be there and present in the moment to give the consumer what they need.
Right. Now, building up on top of what you said earlier, another question from the audience. Do you think it's even possible to solve most or all of the edge cases, right? Would you agree that in many ways, a cultural attitude that teams should employ over time is just keep doing better, right? And keep reacting to the feedback that you get from the customer, just like you said, hey, I never thought about that particular, ways of using our app. Thank you for that. Let's integrate it.
Another brilliant question. Thank you for that. And absolutely. The reality is that if we decided that we were going to solve all of the edge cases, we would never release software, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, something else I'm a massive passionate advocate of is making sure we get software out to customers quickly so we can learn from their experiences and iterate fast. And you're absolutely spot on that if you focus on solving every possible edge case, then you're not going to be able to release software efficiently and effectively. I think what that's a case of doing is making sure that if we are putting software out there, we know what the limitations are. So, if an engineer is aware that something could have a problem, might not work in the way that's expected, and the engineer is the only one who knows about it, that's a problem, because that means no one's thinking about how we might want to solve that in the future. That means no one's making an intelligent decision to say, okay, we're going to put that out there and that's okay for a period of time. But then, after a while, we need to fix that because it's providing a bit of a naff experience. We need to sort that out. So I think as engineers, our job is to make sure that we're communicating really well with our business stakeholders, that we're explaining what the problems are, what we're actually putting into the wild, and that we're going into this with our eyes open. I definitely think the cultural aspect is really important. This comes down to developing, agile product-centric organizations and continually iterating against software. I think that we have, historically, lots of large organizations have focused on a project-led approach. And once the project is finished, then we don't need to go back and continue iterating or continuing to develop. I think that's a really dangerous mindset because the reality is we've put products out there that customers are going to use for many, many years to come. And there is a concept called software rot that you may have come across. So we know that if you build software, it will need to be maintained. There will be security vulnerabilities that need to be patched. There will be things that need to be updated. And why are we not thinking about tech debt in that same way and thinking about, when we go back into that product, can we not improve the software? And I think probably the best analogy that I've got is probably the house building analogy. So if you decide to invest by building a house or a building, you would expect to maintain it. You would expect that you had to paint the walls every so often. You'd expect that every now and again it would need a new carpet, or maybe the garden needs to be mowed. You might not be building brand new features for it. You might not be building a big extension on the back, but you're still expecting to maintain what you've currently got and to make sure that that's livable and you can provide the best experience to the people who are there. You might then choose to invest. You might decide to build a huge extension on the back, and that's new feature development that you might want to go into. But don't just leave a product languishing, with customers getting that suboptimal experience. We need to find ways that we can reconcile financially and reconcile from an investment point of view that software does need to continue to be maintained and can't just be abandoned. Because if you abandon software, it will eventually rot, and that's not good for anybody's reputation.
Oh yeah, we all know that. Indeed. Steve, we only have time for one small question. What is the key advice, the key advice you have for the engineers around the world that are watching us right now? How should they relate to technology, to the technology that they're building? What could be their internal drive to build those products that change lives? Indeed.
So I think for me, I ask myself why I work for Boots. And I joined Boots as an organization because I can have a genuine impact on people's lives. I want to make a difference. And I think that is the same for our engineers, in lots of different disciplines and lots of different industries. We want to have a really positive impact on people's lives. And I think the way to do that is that as engineers, we need to shake off this idea that we are somehow working back of house, or that we're the IT department in the basement that's kind of doing these systems. Mm-hmm. We've got to stand up and proud and talk to our businesses and use our skills in order to help our business colleagues to really drive forward their thinking. Our business colleagues are really intelligent and they have some great ideas, and that's all aligned to driving business value. But actually, we as engineers, we've got a powerful voice too, and we should be using that voice to make sure that our business colleagues are aware of what they're putting into the wild and are taking those things into consideration. As I said in my talk, it's not always possible to put software out there that's perfect. In fact, if you drove to do that, you might never release software. But we should be having an intelligent conversation to make sure that we're using our skills in the best way we can to drive forward business value and business improvement, and always with customer front in mind. If we all make a decision to think about the customer first in everything that we do, I think the overall quality of our software products will raise tenfold overnight.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Steve. That's a good place to wrap. We certainly agree that product focus and customer focus is the way to go. That's software product engineering in a nutshell. So thank you very much for this amazing talk, for agreeing to join us today, and looking forward to visit Boots again, Boots shop there in Heathrow Airport. I usually buy my Boots products from there, and looking forward maybe to see each other in person again in Nottingham.
Very, very much looking forward to it. And thank you to everybody who joined the call. It's been really great talking to you today. Have a great day.
Have a great day, people. Stay in touch. Introducing Game of Pods comes next. Have a great day, everybody.